If you are a parent, my guess is you've had this conversation. It's a conversation that we had with both of our boys as they were growing up, and it goes something like this. You're watching what they're doing, or you're looking at maybe some decisions they're getting ready to make or have made, and you say something like this: hey, listen, you can do it this way, which would be the best way, or you can do it that way and choose the hard way. You can choose the hard way. The hard way, the long, hard path, is usually goes against what is right. Many times it's just unwise, but as parents, we look back and we see our kids making decisions, and you're like, you know what? Why do you keep choosing the hard way? Haven't you learned that the hard way is much harder? It's a longer path. You've had those conversations, I'm sure. I was thinking that my days of saying that to two hard-headed boys were over. And then the other day, down the hall in our house, I hear my wife say to our daughter, who's now 6.5 years old, she's like, Landry, Kate, you can do it this way, or go ahead, choose the hard way. And I was like, oh man, we got a whole nother time to be able to having that same conversation. You've had those. Some of us have lived through those conversations, and that is what we're going to see with the story of Moses today. That Moses along the way continues to choose the hard way. One author said this about Moses. Moses spent the first 40 years of his life thinking he was somebody. As we see last week, he was raised in Pharaoh's home. He has the best schooling. He has the best ability to be a warrior and a fighter. Whatever the finest things in life, Moses, for 40 years, this is him thinking that he is somebody. He'll then spend the next 40 years realizing that he was a nobody. And then his final 40 years, he'll be who God has called him to be as he learns that God can use anybody who will follow him closely, who will put his life in his hands and follow the path of the Lord and not choose the hard way. And so as we pick up the story today in Moses' life, last week we saw Moses. His mom has put him in the Nile River by the reeds. He's picked up and found by Pharaoh's daughter. In God's sovereignty and God's goodness, Pharaoh's daughter asked Moses' mom to nurse him, to take care of him for a little while, and then Moses' mom has to then give Moses back to Pharaoh, and Pharaoh's daughter is going to raise Moses in Pharaoh's home. And so he has the best of everything. He's been living in the big house. We pick up the story in verse 11. Years later, after Moses had grown up, we already read in the book of Acts, he's 40 years old. He went out to his own people, that's the Hebrew people, God's people, and observed their forced labor. He saw an Egyptian striking a Hebrew, one of his own people. Looking all around and seeing no one, he struck the Egyptian dead and hid him in the sand. The next day he went out and saw two Hebrews fighting. He asked the one in the wrong, why are you attacking your neighbor? Verse 14. Who made you commander and judge over us? The man replied. Are you planning to kill me as you killed the Egyptian? Then Moses became afraid and thought, what I did is certainly known. And again, we showed you the verses in Acts as Stephen in the New Testament is getting ready to be martyred. He's telling the religious leaders and the Pharisees how Moses is now connected to Jesus, and kind of gives us a history of the Old Testament. But it was in Acts chapter 7, verse 25, the verses that you read, where he says that Moses assumed his people would understand that God would give them deliverance through him, but they did not understand. So as we're going through the story, here's what I believe. Moses is now 40 years old. We have to understand, take a panoramic view. We have to understand that Moses along the way, he begins to understand and know that he is not Pharaoh's son. He absolutely would discover and know while he's being raised in the big house that he is a Hebrew. The Hebrew people, Moses' mom and his sister and everybody's like, that is Moses. They just celebrated his 5-year birthday. He just turned 20. They know their guy is up in Pharaoh's house. Moses knows, Pharaoh knows. Matter of fact, many historians like Josephus back in the day, back then, they believed that Pharaoh was unable to have his own son, and he was grooming Moses to be the heir apparent. He was grooming Moses. So in this 40 years of Moses' life, I believe he began to understand, I'm a Hebrew. I've been raised here. I have this calling. I believe Moses understood his calling, what he was called to do, how God was wanting to use him, how he had plucked him out of the river, set him up, gave him the best of everything. I think Moses knows this long before, as we'll see next week, the burning bush, where he gets that specific call to go free my people. I think he's been living with this. He goes down, he sees the Egyptian beating up and abusing one of his people. The Bible says he looks this way, he looks that way, make sure no one's looking, and then he starts moving like he is the Redeemer. And then Acts tells us that Stephen tells them that Moses, in his mind, thought that when he sees these two Hebrews fighting, they would be like, oh yeah, you're Moses, you're going to lead us out. And yet Timothy said they did not understand. So I think that's the setting of Moses. He is moving in his own direction. He's doing kind of his own deal. Verse 15, when Pharaoh heard about this, he tried to kill Moses. Again, don't just keep moving through the story because we know the story. Stop. Panoramic view. Why would Pharaoh, who Moses is 40 years old, he's raising him as his own son, gave him the best of everything, why after he just kills some little Egyptian worker out there, you think Pharaoh cared? No. Why does he now want to kill Moses? Don't move so fast you miss the story. I think it's because Pharaoh knows that's a Hebrew guy. I've given him the best. I've set him up to be our leader, but if he goes for his home people, they may rally behind him, and now I have an issue. And so when the Hebrews people, they don't rally behind him. Moses kind of thought that he would. He hears about it. You killed one of our guys. I think Pharaoh's like, I need to take care of the problem as fast as possible. When Pharaoh heard this, he tried to kill Moses. But Moses fled from Pharaoh and went to live in the land of Midian and sat down by a well. We see Moses now entering into his next 40 years of his life, and Moses has been doing and tried to do things his own way. Moses' mom, if she could, as he's heading out to the desert, would probably want to scream across the desert, Moses, why are you choosing the hard way? Why are you choosing the hard way? Now you're having to flee for your life. You're leaving your Pharaoh home, people who know you. You're leaving your Hebrew home, people who know you. And you're going off by yourself choosing the hard way. You want to see what the hard way looks like? The hard way looks like this. This is the desert of Midian. This is where Moses went. He left Pharaoh's palace. He left everything, and he goes to this area, and he sits down. As he finally finds a well, he sits down by the well. As I think of Moses leaving everything he knows, kind of leaving his calling as he's walking into the desert, I think of this leadership idea, this principle. It says a person who thinks he's a leader but has no one following him is only going on a walk. That's Moses. He's by himself. He's heading out to the desert. And he thought he was all of that. He spent his first 40 years thinking he's somebody. There's no one following him. He is all by himself. Here's our first lesson that we can pull out of this story. I can't follow God's will while doing things my way. I can't follow God's will daily, be all that God's called me and is leading me to be, and do things my way. Cannot happen. Let me ask you a question. Have you ever jumped out in front of what God is doing in front of God's planning and his timing, trying to force things along. It really didn't feel like God was in it. It didn't really feel like God was kind of leading, but you wanted it and you're going to do it, so you're going to force it. You ever done that? Kind of force God's timing? What happens when you do that? You kind of look back and like, this did not go. Oh, I'm choosing to do things the hard way. Many of us, this steadying of life here at the Team Church, we have kids going off to college. It reminded me of my freshman year in college, and I went to a Christian college in West Palm Beach. So I remember being there. I remember one of our first classes, first professors. The professor looks at all the guys. He says, listen, you need to understand, you're at a Christian university, and you need to understand a principle that a lot of the girls have here. It's called, they want to make sure they have a ring by spring. And so you need to make sure that you're following after what the Lord has. And it was true. For the next couple of weeks and months, I mean, it's like everybody is forcing the relationship, are you going to be my husband? Are you going to be my husband? They're just walking around because everybody wants a ring by spring. And many times, not only in Christian colleges, but in other colleges, other situations where people are forcing that agenda, usually by about June or July, when summer hits, there's a devastation of a breakup, the ring gets thrown back at somebody, it's all over because we forced an issue. We tried to move forward with the will of God. I can promise you this, that one of the most frequent questions, highest percent of questions that I get from people as a pastor, they're like, hey, how can I know the will of God? How do I know God's will? How do I know what job, who to marry, where to go? How do I know God's will? I want to give to you Romans chapter 12, verse 2. Do not be conformed to this age, but be transformed by the renewing of your mind, so that you may discern what is the good, pleasing, and perfect will of God. That you can discern what is the good and perfect will of God. And here's what I want to tell you about living in God's will. Listen really, really clearly. You don't go find God's will, you live in it daily. I have a picture, an interactive picture I want to show you up here. If I'm starting here, so many people think that God's will, I'm going to discover God's will. If I can just discover God's will, this what? It could be the person in my freshman English class. It could be, oh, that's the job, that's the house, that's the whatever, and I've got to find, like it's a treasure, I got to find God's will, and then I'm just going to dart straight to it, knowing all along that that is God's will. This is what God told me. This is what I'm going to do. And now you know what? God owes that to me because he told me that, and I heard him, and that is specifically, and it's usually a what. What is God's will? This type of living leads to all kinds of challenges. Because maybe the God's will is a person. I'm going to marry, that's God's will for me to marry that person. Because you know, and it's very romantic, there's one person set aside before all time. I got to go, that's the person. Well, what happens if they marry somebody else? What happens if they don't like you? Maybe this perfect job, maybe there's something, but all of a sudden when we have a what, and we think we can go find God's will, and that's what it is, then all of a sudden, when it doesn't go our way, then we blame God. Many people begin to deconstruct their faith because it didn't work. We are never told to live this way. It's too much pressure. We don't have that kind of infinite wisdom. We are finite. How does it work? It works more like this. I'm here, and I know that God has a will for my life, so what I'm going to begin doing is not trying to find God's will, but live in it daily. And so I'm reading God's word, and I'm reading his word, and I'm praying, and I'm not sure about next week or next month specifically, but I know what I'm doing, and the best I can know God's will, I'm going to then take the first step in God's will. And I'm going to continue praying. I'm going to continue having Bible study. I'm going to continue living out. And I'm going to continue not trying to find God's will, but live in it each day. And each day as I'm living in God's will, I'm moving forward and I continue praying. I continue asking the Lord for guidance in this day, seeing what's happening. And never make a mistake of thinking that the Bible that we have, God's truth, cannot lead you daily in understanding God's perfect will by the renewing of your mind. And so we read through, I want to encourage everybody here. We want to focus more and first on the verses of the Bible and what God is saying, more than going out and listening to the voices of other people. Should we listen to the voices giving us good advice? Absolutely, you want to do that. But you do that after you're seeking to live by God's verses, his words, what he's telling you to do, his perfect will, so that you can understand the moral steps. You can understand that he's leading, guiding you. Again, God would never give you that kind of pressure that you know exactly what it is. No, it's just a daily living in God's will, living in God's will, and this is what happens. Then at some point you turn around and you go, what was God's will for my life? Oh, I see what he was doing there. Oh, I didn't understand it there, but then I did this. And each day, and then as we look back, now with confidence, we say, this was the will of God. This is where God wanted me to go. He's leading me. And so every so often I can look back, you've been there. I can look back and see what God is doing. And now it makes a little more sense. But I don't have that pressure of expecting God to do the what, because I'm more focused on the who. I want to follow Christ. I want to follow his Holy Spirit, and making sure that I'm not doing what so much has happened to Christianity, that I'm going to follow my will, and it's going to go for my happiness. Everything is about what I want to do, because again, this gets very tricky. It gets very difficult, because if we're focused more on one specific thing, and then when it gets challenging, we are more likely to then not do what God asks us to do, because many times what God is asking us to do is sacrificial. It's selfless and it hurts, but I can begin to compromise what God is doing daily in my life if I'm thinking that, oh, that's what I'm going to do, so I don't really have to do these things because that's the most important. I got to go get the what and not worry about the who, but I'm going to live daily. And again, when I get here, then I look back. Now, is that how easy it works? Oh, no. Go back over here. Following God daily, many times, as I'm doing what God asked me to do, I know, I don't know, again, all the steps, but I know today I'm going to live in God's will, and I take a step. But the reality is I take that step, the path is not perfect. It becomes all kind of chaos, right? And so now I'm going over here, and I would have not believed God would have asked me to do that. He wanted me to sacrifice and do that. I thought he was good. And then there's pitfalls, and then there's medical emergencies, and then this happens. And the reality is it's all over the place, but you're still following. And when you get here, you may not have liked everything that happened. You may not have understood everything was happening, but you look back and say, I wasn't looking for God's will. I was living in it daily. And along the way, it didn't go exactly how I thought, but now that I'm looking back, I can see he was with me. Why? Because I was walking with him daily. This is what we see in Moses' life. This is what we see in our own life. Have you ever rushed out again before God? Have you been so interested and so going after the what, that person, that job? I just want to tell you again, friends, don't put that much pressure on yourself that you think that you can know specifically in 10 years that is God's will. There's nowhere in the Bible that would tell us that that's the best way to live our life. It's a daily discovering. Again, not trying to go find your happiness and not go for following your heart, but following the heart of God daily, so that when we get here, we look back, oh yeah, I see, this is what God was doing, and now with confidence we can say, oh, that was the will of God. That's an incredible way to live. When we see Moses, he has run to hide in the desert. He's sitting by a well. He's absolutely choosing the hard way. I want to make sure we understand this before I read the rest of the story. Remember, the stories in the Old Testament tell us kind of what happened, and many times it can tell us what happened over many weeks or years. So as I read through this, don't insert that this all happened in 5 days. This is a retelling of what was happening, because Moses is going to be in Midian in the desert for another 40 years. He took quite the detour. Exodus chapter 2, verse 16. Now the priest of Midian had 7 daughters. They came to draw water and filled the troughs to water their father's flock. Remember, Moses is sitting there by the well. Then some shepherds arrived and drove them away. But Moses came to their rescue, and he watered their flock. When they returned to their father Reuel, he asked, "Why have you come back so quickly today?" They answered, "An Egyptian," which means Moses is still dressed for success. He's still dressed like Pharaoh's son. They understand what an Egyptian looks like. He didn't look like a slave. He didn't look like a Hebrew. He looked like an Egyptian. An Egyptian rescued us from the evil shepherds. He even drew water for us, and he watered our flock. So where is he? He asked his daughters. Why then did you leave the man behind? Invite him to eat dinner. I want to push pause because I want to give you some free for those of us who are later in teen lives, those of us who are still single. I want to give you some free dating advice. Single ladies, all the single ladies. Look for a man who will go out of his way to protect you, to provide for you, to work for you, and has the courage to stand up when other people are doing negative things to you. And not just in some mental assent, but he actually rescued them. He's probably taking care of the shepherds, and then he waters their flock. When you want someone who will do these things, that you see it in their life, and he'll do it for you when you need it. That's the kind of person you're looking for. Moses agreed, verse 21, Moses agreed to stay with the man, and he gave his daughter Zipporah to Moses in marriage. Again, that probably didn't happen that day, but he's staying. What's he probably doing? He's working. They're seeing Moses. And again, I want to give it's just free today. Just free dating advice. Every dad wants his baby girl to marry a man who will protect and has the courage to work and be selfless and provide. I was reading through this. I was thinking through both of my boys. I've told them their whole life, especially as they were graduating and getting ready to go off and leave and be their own person. I've told seniors and high school boys here for many, many years, which is this: hey, just look around. The competition to get the best girls in the culture you're growing up in is very weak. If you will be a strong, confident in Christ, strong, willing to sacrifice, willing to be selfless, have grit, be willing to protect, be willing to come across like a man who's strong and confident, will help. We call that word chivalry. If you're willing to do that and the girls see it in today's culture, your competition is small, because we're raising a whole culture of weak men who are not confident, who will not step up and provide and protect. Those of us who have been around a while, we see this happening in our culture. So I told my boys, I was like, you just do that, you'll probably have the pick of the best. Because the dads out there, they're telling their daughters, hey, this is what you're looking for. You're not looking for some weak, milquetoast guy who can't fight, who can't stand up, who's not willing to die for you, to be selfless, to be sacrificial. So guys, you look to be that. All the single ladies, you're looking for that. And my guess is that is kind of where you want to be. So that's just free dating advice today from me. Be that person. But even, the good thing, even when we, like Moses, because he does good there, but he's out in the desert, even when we choose the hard way and we stray, here's great news. God gives us new chances. That's the story here. Again, that didn't all happen like in 3 days. That's the story here. Moses, you've gone astray. You've gone over here doing your things your own way, but I still have a calling on your life. I still want to move in your life, so I'm going to give you new chances. Here's a great life lesson that all of us need to hear. Where God leads, he intercedes. Where God leads, he intercedes, and he's powerful enough. He's all-knowing. Remember last week, he's sovereign. But we still have the ability to make our own choices. And God then can intercede as we are following after him. God is supernaturally involved with Moses. He hasn't given up on him yet. Some of us need to hear that. He didn't give up on Moses, who absolutely has chosen the hard way. God supernaturally is involved. And as we follow daily in the direction, as we're taking each step, following God, because remember, you don't go find God's will, you live in it daily. And as you're living in it daily, God then can intercede and show you the most excellent way, the Bible says. He can show you what he wants to do in your life, and we can rest in that. I said this last week. Understanding that God is sovereign, and he's all-powerful, he's all-knowing. He's involved in our life, that he loves us. Understanding that and living that out is not simplistic, but it is simple. And so I'm going to say the same thing I said last week, because I had this conversation many times this week with people from last week. You'd be amazed at the stress and the anxiety that you can begin to rest in. Why? Because as best I can, I'm living daily in God's will. I know he's involved, and no matter how chaotic it gets, I can rest. I can trust that God's not caught off guard. Remember, as we're walking along, it's not like God's, oh, I had no idea you were going to do that. Can't believe that happened. We rest in that understanding. I'm telling you, friends, that's spiritual maturity. When you can look at what's happening, not like it, not agree with it, not be happy, but when you can look at what's happening and know that God is in control, you can rest. I was thinking through this again. We're back in the parenting of young kids again as we have Landry Kate. Many of you don't know this. We have adopted her. But long before we had her, we began, again, daily, right? We believe, not that we got some specific type of girl, some specific type of person. We just believed as we were moving along that the Lord was leading us to adopt. And we still had Brady, I think it was like in 7th grade, leading us to adopt. And we took a step, and sometimes we look back, and what we were being told by the adoption agency is like, listen, it's a little hard to hear this, but a lot of people aren't choosing you. You're kind of old. You got other kids. And so when they're looking through who they want to adopt, they're not choosing you. And so the months turned into years, and we're still just trusting and moving forward. And then all of a sudden, we finally get a call, and now the call is going to go fast and rapid. And even though we had been planning, it was going to move so fast that we didn't have the finances to do certain stages in adoption. You have to hit certain milestones, and they're like, we found somebody, they actually like you, they actually trust you with their kid, and so now you've got to have this amount to give to us now. We're like, whoa, because again, we were caught off guard. And yet where God leads, he intercedes. And so people who knew about our situation, what we were trying to do, they stepped up and gave to the adoption center to hit those goals so that we could move forward. And literally from the time that we were chosen to the time that Landry Kate was born, I think was about 9 days. It moved quick. And now, 6.5 years later, there's no way we could have ever known. Oh, yeah, that's right. I prayed. God told me I'm going to adopt this kind of kid. You don't know that. You're going day by day. Now we look back. We're like, she fits perfect into our family. She's doing all of these things, and we can look back and we go, oh, yeah, you see that, what God did there? Oh, he intervened there. Oh, we see that. Oh, yeah, she's doing this. She talks a lot. Probably could have changed that if we could. Can't. But you can look back. That's what that means. Where God leads, he has the all-power and all-knowing power and wisdom to intercede. But there's also some really good news when you choose to follow God. There's some good news. When you willfully choose, when I willfully choose to sin, to deviate, God never gives up on you. He didn't give up on Moses. He never gives up on you. So because you know you have a God who, as you're going and you take a sinful step, you deviate, he does not give up on you, then don't give up on God's story that he's invited you to be a part of. That's Moses. Moses, I'm going to free my people. I've given you every opportunity to be that dude. What are you going to do with it? He deviates, does some dumb things. We're going to see some more dumb things. But he ends up being able to be used by God when he understands that God will use anybody who will follow after him, even if there had been some deviation. So don't give up on yourself in the sense of that you're in God's story and he wants to use you. Now, I want to push pause real quick. And everybody make sure that you're focused up here and listening. Because we need to understand this. When you and I want to live apart from God's will, that moral will, not following after what God says, very clearly in the scriptures, this is what you do, this is what you don't do, it's very clear. The perfect will of God, the renewing of your mind. Just know this. If you choose and you want to do your own thing and you want to deviate and you want to go against God's best, guess what? He will let you. He will let you. We are not drones. And although we believe in the sovereignty of God, we also believe in our willful choices. We are not drones. And God will allow you, if you want to say, I'm doing things my way, and move, he'll be like, all right. And then we go back to the daily moving. Many of us, sometimes it's not like some drastic, horrible thing, but we kind of deviate. We know we're deviating from God's moral will or what he's leading us to do. We kind of take a little step over here. That's not a big deal. But then we take a step over here. That's not a big deal. And every little no big deal step, all of a sudden one day we wake up, we're 22, 23, 50, whatever it is, and we're like, dang. Every little step that I deviated now has me so far from God's best, from what he wanted to do in my life. I think this is the story of Moses. That cat spent 40 years in the desert in Midian because he had deviated, and God let him do, and God will allow us to do that too. Listen, we need to understand that we can have great desire to do things. Great desire with small discernment leads to the hard road. If you're not discerning, doesn't matter how much desire you have, choosing the hard road. Passionate ambition. I want to be great. I want to do great things. Sometimes I want to do great things for God, but I'm going to do it my way. Passionate ambition without personal accountability will always lead to the long, hard road. And all of us need to understand that if we want to choose that way, God will let us. The good news is The great news is that when we want to repent, when we want to stop doing things our own way and go back to daily, not finding God's will, but living in God's will daily, God says, okay, glad to have you back. Let's get moving. That's what we're going to see next week with Moses. Let's get moving to where I wanted you to be. Where God leads, he intercedes. And he will allow us to make our own path if we choose to go our own way. But he's there to intercede with a helping, but also to intercede with grace, to intercede with forgiveness. So while Moses was off in a distant land, God was still in control, and he's still interceding. Again, take a panoramic view. That's what's getting ready to happen right here in verse 23. After a long time, the king of Egypt died. The Israelites groaned because of their difficult labor. They cried out, and their cry for help because of the difficult labor ascended to God. God heard their groaning, and God remembered his covenant with Abraham and Isaac and with Jacob. And what was his covenant? I'm going to rescue you. And I've given Moses every opportunity, but that dude's out in the desert. And here's what we need to understand. Dads, when you willfully choose to deviate away from the perfect will of God, his morals, his way, when you choose to do that, you are also impacting other people. Same will be true for moms, same is true for all of us. Like a rock hitting a pond, the ripple effects touches our family and our friends. When we deviate willfully and we do our own thing, we're not just doing our own thing. There's actually people who are negatively impacted. What's happening here? Panoramic view. While Moses is in Midian, God's people, the Hebrews, the nation of Israel, God's people, they're still throwing babies in the river and killing the boys. They're getting the snot beat out of them by Egyptians who are taskmasters and using them for slaves. Moses is over there. But his ability to deviate, to not go God's way, do his own thing, now there's still repercussions of people. But the good news is this. God heard their groaning, and God remembered his covenant with Abraham, with Isaac, and with Jacob. Verse 25, God saw the Israelites, and God knew. That should be great for us to hear. It's also challenging for us to hear. God saw his own people throwing their babies in the water. God saw his own people being whipped and abused. God saw, and God knew. And he heard their cries, and he heard their groanings. And now, as we're going to see next week, he's going to recommission, get another calling. Come on, Moses. But while that was happening, the Hebrew here has a very intimate way of saying God in an intimate way knows. Here's our last lesson for today. God sees you, and God knows. Some of us have come in here today. There's no one here in this building. There's no one down the kids ministry as you were dropping off your kids. There's no one who knows what's really going on in your home except for you and maybe your family. And you're wondering, because it's so difficult, it's so challenging, you're wondering, has God left? Does God know? The principle here that we see in this story, but all the way through the Old Testament, all the way through the New Testament is God knows. He sees you. He knows what's going on. He hears the cry of your heart. Many of us have those situations. And sometimes we'll walk into work or church or other places and we put a smile on our face, but the reality is there's a tear in our heart. Our heart is breaking. We don't know what's going on. And some of us just need to hear today, go ahead and start praying, groaning, telling God, and then know that he sees you. He knows you. In the New Testament, Matthew chapter 10, the Bible talks about how God knows when a sparrow, a bird, falls out of a tree, hits the ground. God knows. God knows the numbers of hairs on our head. By looking around here, that's not real hard for some. I know some of the numbers of hair in your heads. But for most of us, that's a difficult thing. Why was the Bible telling us that? It's an intimacy thing. The Hebrew words here used for God sees and God knows, there's an intimacy. But not only does he see and know, but friends, he cares and he's all powerful. He can intercede. He can come in. Now, at this point, I could be like the TV pastors and those who want to peddle all the books and tell you, you just pray like the Hebrew people. And God's going to come in and send your... That's not always true. What we do know is God compassionately knows, he sees, and he will give us the ability on that path of life to sometimes not take us out of the challenge, not take us out of the fire, but to be with us in it. He gives us the peace that passes all understanding. He gives us the grace in the midst of the trouble that he may not take out of your life. So don't ever believe that. He can, and many times he does. But whatever is going on, you can rest that you haven't been left alone. You can rest that the Lord knows, he sees, he cares. And he gives peace and grace. It is here where Paul says, no matter what's going on in my life, I have learned this, that God's grace is sufficient for me. Not because he took the pain away, not because I like what was happening, but his grace was sufficient. Now in this story, God hears the groaning, God hears the cries, and Moses, under the power and leadership now of God, a whole lot more humble, is coming. And in this story, they will be free. But remember we said last week, you're not Hebrews and nation of Israel in captivity in Egypt. The character part, the part that we can understand is God sees and God knows. I'm going to ask you to close your eyes. Because I believe there are some people here today, could be a single, could be an older adult, could be families. Before we leave, I want you to be able to have a moment that you cry out to God, knowing that he sees you, he knows you. He knows everything that you would say, but we are to tell God. What do you need to tell God? To understand that he sees and knows. Others of us here, we have deviated. We've been tracing way too many whats and not whos. We haven't had the renewing of our mind to then follow hard after Christ, to know his perfect will each day. We also need to have a prayer. God, in this moment, it is my prayer, no matter where we are today, that we would understand and know that you love us. You are all powerful, all knowing. And God, you want to intercede in our life. And God, for those who need to experience and know today that you see them, you know, I pray, God, that they would feel that. That they would be able to whisper, even in the middle of their pain, that your grace and your love and your peace is sufficient. And then, God, for those of us who need to confess that we have deviated, and maybe even confess that our deviation from your moral will, from your perfect will, has caused ripple effects of challenges for people that we care about. So God, we confess that, and as we'll see Moses next week, we want to jump back in tune. So God, we thank you for hearing us, for knowing us, for guiding us, for leading us. We ask it in your name. Amen.